And thank you so much for coming out today for this event called Decolonizing Place in Conversation with Malik Al Nasir. I'm Dr. Sreya Datta of the Department of English, and I'll be chairing the conversation today before we throw it out to you, to the public. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome Malik to the University of Liverpool. He's had a long association with the university, and hopefully we'll speak about that today. This event sort of emerged from the need to think a bit more critically about place, what that means, about Liverpool, and especially the idea of literary studies, or what does it mean to think about place from the perspective of English literary studies, and the English department itself. So it's kind of like an institutional question, as well as just a question about what we teach or what we learn. And I'm saying this obviously with the full awareness that the city, the institution, and the very room that we are sitting in today has directly or indirectly benefited in some way from the transatlantic slave trade. And this will hopefully be a series of conversations on decolonizing place, with the focus on literary and historical implications of such conversations. And perhaps there is no one better than Malik who can speak to all these concerns, and I will introduce him properly in a moment. But before that, I would like to thank the Center for the Study of International Slavery and the Department of English for funding this event. To each and every one of you who has come out today, and of course to Malik himself. I would also like to thank the staff of this building. They're not in this room at the moment, but they have ensured that everything goes smoothly, so I would like to extend my thanks to them as well. A couple of housekeeping sort of things before we begin. So as you can see, this room has one exit. If you need to leave while the event is in progress, I request that you do so as quietly and as inobtrusively as possible. There are toilets right outside as you go, and a water fountain should you need to replenish your bottle. There's also a lift right outside this building in the foyer. So if you need the lift to go downstairs or come upstairs, please do use that. There is also a QR code on that door, as you see, and I especially encourage students in the room to fill that code as a kind of feedback for this event. Share your thoughts, share what you want to see more of. It will just help us try to incorporate those things as we move forward, so that the event is not just limited to this evening, but actually is a continuing conversation. Finally, after the question and answer, Malik will be signing copies of his book. And I also saw some CDs, so you're selling your music as well, which is really exciting. So the table has been set up just outside this door. So that will be just after the Q&A. And I request that you allow Malik to go out first, just so that there's some time so that he can sit and prepare himself to greet each and every one of you. There's also a very modest reception out in the foyer, which you might have seen, which again is after the Q&A. So I think that's all about the sort of housekeeping things. And I'd like to now introduce Malik to those in this room. For many of you, I'm sure that Malik will need no introduction, but just want to read out some of the very marvelous things that he's done. So Malik Al Nasir is an author, poet, and academic from Liverpool. His memoir, Letters to Gil, is a compelling account of his childhood experiences in a brutal UK local authority care system, which at 18 left him traumatized, semi-literate, homeless, and destitute. A chance meeting with poet and activist Gil Scott-Heron was to prove life-changing, setting him on a path to success. Malik is currently reading for a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge on a full ESRC scholarship, and he's just been awarded the prestigious Sidney Smith Memorial Prize for Outstanding Achievement at St. Catherine's College, Cambridge. Malik is also the recipient of the University of Cambridge Vice-Chancellor's Award for Global Impact for his work around enslavement and reparations. So please join me in welcoming Malik today.
Thank you so much. I'd like to also echo the sentiments of Sreya and thank the Centre for the Study of International Slavery for putting this event on with the Faculty of English, and thank you to all you guys as well for taking the time to come out and find this place. I personally couldn't find this place. I had to phone Sreya to get me in. And I know there's a few others up here who struggled to find the place as well. So we started a little bit late today, and I'm quite happy to go on a little bit late if that's not a problem, just so that we can sort of keep to the time frame that we had. Any of you guys need to go on time. We certainly understand that. But thank you all for coming out today. So how would we like to, you want to do this as an in-conversation?
Yeah, if that's fine, because I have a series of burning questions that I would love to ask you.
Burning questions we do.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
And I found it difficult to find this place myself. I come here every day. So I'm really sorry about the unclear kind of instructions on the Eventbrite. I'll make sure to be very specific for future events. Malik, I just wanted to start by asking you about, the idea of the university itself as a place or as a concept. Because, your path to education has not been linear. And would you like to tell us a little bit about how you've got to where you are now, considering the fact that, education which we take for granted is not something that is available to many?
Yeah, so my pathway to education was really skewed because at the age of 9 I was taken into local authority care. So when you go into local authority care, you are essentially persona non grata. You're off the grid. No one's giving you no key performance indicators. There's no milestones. There's no expectations that you would achieve anything. You're not going to sit any qualifications. And for the most part, for the 9 years I spent in local authority care, I spent most of that time out of education. So I missed 18 months of primary school education. I only had 18 months of secondary school education. So I had 0 qualifications. And at 18, when they sort of dumped me in a hostel for the homeless called Ujama House in Topsted in Liverpool, I was semi-literate because I'd spent most of my time working on a farm and doing practical things like woodwork and joinery, and they thought, we're maladjusted children, so, if we learn these trades and things, we'll be better off to society. But they didn't really give us much education. They had rudimentary education on the premises, but it was not the kind that you would expect someone going to a school. I think in all my time in the care system, I only encountered 2 children that had actually gone to an outside school, and they were both white kids, and they were both considered to have potential. I didn't have any potential, and I didn't go, so I never had that opportunity. So coming out of that system, this sort of linear path that you described, where people would go through, from school to college, university, etc. There's an upside and a downside to not having that. The downside to it is obviously you don't have the requisite, entry criteria at each point. So, at 16 you can't get into a college because you don't have at that time, GCO levels or CSIS. Then, you don't have the A levels, so then you've got to try and find your way in as a mature student and try and find the back route, which I did through BTEC many years later. How you are at 18 has a tendency then to dictate the rest of your academic future. So, if you did 3 A levels and got A stars and whatever, then the chances are you'll get into a decent university, Russell Group University, then you can go on and you can get funding, and, that linear path that you described becomes much more clear. In my case, that didn't happen. I didn't have any of those, so I had to find different ways to do that. And the first step was to become literate. And I found that the system itself excluded me and kept me out. I didn't meet any of the criteria necessary to get into any of these things, whether it was the progression to college and university, or when I eventually did get into college and university through the back door, to get an actual route through to being funded. So I've had to find alternative ways to subvert that system at each point. In the case of my encounter with Gilskar Heron, who was an academic himself, he had a master's from Lincoln, he was a poet. He encouraged me to use poetry to become literate, And then through that level of literacy, I did some positive action programs that put me in college on a BTEC, and I was able to do, day release funded by my employer. And because of the results that I got on the BTEC, I was able to get into what was then not even a university, Liverpool Hub. It was Liverpool Institute of Higher Education at the time. It didn't have university status. So my first introduction to Liverpool University was because it was Hope was a college accredited by Liverpool University. So when you look at your alma mater, when you're going for funding and when you're going to try and do your masters, you're talking about someone who's got no O-levels, no A-levels, from an institution that wasn't even recognised as a university when he joined. It got its university status halfway through. My application, when I come to go to PhD, and I put my application into Cambridge, my application was put in the bin. Now, I'm not talking metaphorically. My application was, in fact, in the bin. And the story behind that is that I'd been invited by the librarian at Cambridge University to come and present some of my findings about my research tracing my ancestry back through slavery and colonialism in Demerara at the Faculty of Latin American Studies. And I presented there with a case of imposter syndrome. Oh my God, I'm at Cambridge, all these anthropologists and historians, they're going to bust me out and I'm going to present this research and they're going to rubbish it. And I sat in the room with all these people and I presented what I'd found and they didn't know any of it. And they were like, this is seminal research, you need to come here and we need to supervise you. But the reason that I say that there's an upside to this is that I was not constrained by the paradigm. I was not sitting there looking at the historiography in the way that they did. I was not, stuck in, this curricula that has these boundaries to it that says if you study this subject, you do it in this way, you adopt this methodological approach and you deliver this thing. I was completely self-taught. I was just, I was like an autodidact. It was just, I was not doing it with any constraints. So I was taking the various different things and I was researching myself. And I was deploying them in different ways that would not necessarily have been the way that you would be encouraged to deploy the way you're working within the constraints of a paradigm. So as a consequence of that, I was looking at things in ways that other people didn't look at them. For instance, when I did my research into my ancestry back through slavery and colonialism, I wasn't looking at slavery as a subject. I wasn't looking at the early modern period. I wasn't looking at, the Industrial Revolution or any of these things, these sets of things that people are taught to look at. I was just tracing my family, and I got back to a certain point and slavery happened, and I got to a certain point and colonialism happened, and I got to a certain other point and something else happened. And the prosopography of that dictated the narrative and the ontology of how these things were interconnected came as a result of genealogy, which was not really considered to be a legitimate methodological approach. But it was the only way you could see what I came to see, which made my research seminal, which is why when I went to Cambridge, they said, you need to come here and we want to supervise you. So then I was back in that same problem again. I put my application in, I went to Hope, I got a 2-2, bin, okay? My supervisor went to the academic office and he was like, what's happening with this application? He said, it's in the bin. He said, no, process this. He took it out, he said, process it. So the first call at Cambridge is your top copy. So your alma mater, did you get a first class honours? Did you get a master's with distinction? Did you go to Russell Group University? No, bin. Academics don't see your proposal, okay? This is an administrative call. Once it was out of the bin, and he said, process this, the top copy comes off, and then they're just looking at your research proposal. So when he looked at the research proposal, they're like, okay, it's going to academics blind, they don't know who it is, and they scored it so high that not only did I get offered a place, but I also got on the list for funding. But once you're on the list for funding, they put the top copy back on and give it to the funders. So it's like, now I'm not going to get no funding, so I'm like in August, and it's like, if you can't show you've got 75 grand by the 15th of August, your place is withdrawn and you're going to lose your opportunity to go to Cambridge. So I'm sitting there trying to work out how to remortgage my house and what I'm going to do. One of my friends said, look, we'll just do a crowdfunder. So we're planning this crowdfunder now, but he said you need to create some hype. You know, if you don't have some hype around the crowdfunder, no one's going to contribute to it and you won't be able to make a scholarship. So I said, okay, shall I just publish some of the research? And he said, yeah. So I spoke to a few journalists, and the Times were like, yeah, we want it. The BBC were like, yeah, we want it. So then, you know, the Times went to put the thing out, and the BBC said, no, we're embargoing it. We want to do it first. And they did this 5-chapter piece called Searching for My Slave Roots. You can Google it. And that went out, and I got a call. It went out at midnight, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, the editor called me and said, it's done 1 million reads overnight, and it done 1.5 million by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the Times put out a full page, and the Daily Mail lifted a copy from the Times, and did a double Daily Mail. I mean, they've got a wide readership. It did a double-page spread on it, and then it sort of went a bit viral. So then the optics for Cambridge were like, well, you know, why is this seminal research happening and Cambridge is not funding it? And then in the middle of a slavery inquiry, they've got legacies of slavery going on, and it didn't look good. So they put an application together. I had 2 days to apply for it, which I did. And then 3 days later, I was awarded a full ESRC scholarship under widening participation. Cambridge doesn't widen participation. Cambridge narrows participation. But the provisions under ESRC and all the other UKRI funding strands is that you have the ability to do widening participation if you want, but most of the academic institutions, particularly the Russell Group institutions, they really don't want to do it. They don't want to bring in people with 2-2s. You know, Diane Abbott got a 2-2. Leona Vaughan, who's now at the United Nations, got a 2-2. You know, there are people out there with 2-2s that actually circumstances, intersectional disadvantage, where they're coming from, what their starting point is. My starting point was I couldn't read at 18. Subterranean. You know, we're starting so far below ground that we, just to get to that point where we can enter the system, is not really a reflection of, you know, our capacity or our capabilities. My capabilities are not in question, what I'm doing now. The system is the thing that was in question, because the system was in loco parentis, or in the parent from me from the age of 9. They had full charge of my education from the age of 9. They were responsible for me being semi-literate at 18. So the system rendered me into that situation that I was in. It wasn't about my abilities or my capacity. It was about their inability to be able to do anything other than what they did with me, or their desire to do that. So where did that system come from? So the more I looked into the legacies of slavery and colonialism, and particularly Liverpool being the epicenter of it, I started to see that the characters that emerged in my family tree were in fact people who were responsible for making the legislation, both in Parliament and at a civic level as well, in terms of running the Liverpool Corporation. These are people who made endowments. We were looking at the endowments that they made to the foundation of Newnham College at Cambridge. You know, these particular slave traders, John Gladstone, Samuel Sandbach, Philip Frederick Tinney, John Ernst Tinney, John Abram Tinney, these guys were all involved in financing the establishment of Newnham College at Cambridge. All of their children went to Oxford. You know, they built so many institutions that were institutions of learning. The Royal Institution in Colquitt Street, Thomas Stewart Trail, another family member, founded that institution. That institution brought Charles Dickens to speak. They promoted Darwin's theory, the same theories that were being used to say that black people were further down the evolutionary chain, closer to monkeys than men, you know, and therefore could be categorized as property. The same theories that were being promoted, the pseudosciences that underpinned the eugenics movement, and that said that, you know, Australian Aboriginals can be classed as flora and fauna, and killing one of them is no different than killing a kangaroo. You know, they created the institutions. They created the laws that regulated the institutions. You know, they contributed to the botanical gardens at Kew, the World Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. They were involved in the botanical gardens here. The Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, later during the colonial period, they were involved in the founding of that. John Ernst Tinney was the treasurer there. The Blue Coat School, which trained people through indentureship to work as clerks and merchants for the merchant houses in Liverpool, founded in 1797 by these people. The Athenaeum, we've got some members from the Athenaeum here today, founded by William Roscoe, co-founded by William Roscoe, a member of this same family that was involved in, he was an abolitionist, but he took all his money from slave traders. And a lot of these institutions across the medical sciences, the natural sciences, across the art and cultural industries, the museums that were founded by people like William Brown and the Walker Art Gallery and these kind of places. All of these institutions, many of which exist today, were created by people who had a certain mentality. They had an attitude towards the taking away of people's freedom, the exploitation of people, the subjugation of people based on race, and the exploitation of those people for their own benefits, and then the propagation of these pseudosciences in order to justify that. And when they made those justifications, they had to have the academic backups for that. And these very institutions were funded in order to create those narratives, in order to perpetuate that colonial enterprise, as it were.
Thank you so much for that sort of detailed analysis and critique of the institution, because, often we sort of think about decolonizing in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, just what we teach, but not really about the institutional context of that as well. And, I sort of also was very fascinated by the fact that a lot of your research has come from these chance encounters or chance events. So you met Gil Scott-Heron in 1984, if I'm not wrong, and you met him backstage, and that was just an event that happened, like you were not planning for it, it was not premeditated. Even your current research, you saw a resemblance to a person called Andrew Watson, and that started you off on this journey towards uncovering a history that has been buried, that is very difficult to find in the archives. So what's your take on the kind of chance events that have happened in your life so far?
I mean, I haven't kind of looked at it in that way because, things happen in life and then you react to those things and you develop things on the basis of what happens and the opportunities that present themselves. And, growing up in the care system and black communities, opportunities don't present themselves that often. So when an opportunity does present itself, it's like a lifeline. You grab it with both arms and you swing like Tarzan, you know what I mean? It's just, you want to hold on to those opportunities. So in 2003, there was a documentary produced by BBC Scotland by a guy called Brendan O'Hara called Scotland's Lost Captain, the story of Andrew Watson. And they have been doing a series of programmes around 100 years of black footballers, from a guy called Arthur Walton, who played for Basketball End at the turn of the 20th century, through to like John Bowman's, Justin Fashanu, and those guys were playing in like the 90s. And I sat and just watched this programme, and then right at the end of it, they said, there's another programme coming on from a discovery that was made whilst they were doing the research. So they'd done 100 years of black footballers, from 1890 to 1990. But they discovered in the Scottish Football Archives, Scottish Football Museum, some old annuals with a picture of a black guy in the 1880s playing for Scotland and Queen's Park and a number of other clubs. A guy called Andrew Watson looked exactly like me. I showed a picture to my daughter. She went, that's you. I was like, this guy was born in 1856. In Demerara, where my father come from with our family name, which was Watson. I changed my name when I became a Muslim. I changed to Al Nasir. I was Mark Watson. So, my father was Reginald Wilcox Watson, my grandfather was George Edward Watson, and, we come from Demerara and Babis in Guyana. So he came from the same place, and his father was a white Scottish sugar planter called Peter Miller Watson. And he was the family representative for a company called Sam Baxtinian Company, which was officially founded in 1813, but the entities that became Sam Baxtini started in Grenada in the 1790s and were primarily dealers in, quote, sugar, molasses and prime Gold Coast Negroes. So they were landing cargoes of slaves from West Africa, and they were running sugar plantations in Grenada and making absolute fortunes. And they had operations in Liverpool, Glasgow, Trinidad, Demerara, and also in the early years they were involved also with Bristol, as we recently came to discover. So I've been tracing my ancestry back. And I'm looking at this guy and I'm thinking to myself, he looks like me, he's from the same place where my dad's from, he's got the same family name as our family name, there's got to be a connection, and that started me on a journey. So that journey led to the discovery of this guy's whole entire family. And again, another kind of epic story of empire, if you like, because of the institutions that were founded by this slave trading family. And that became the subject not only of my personal sort of genealogical research, but the research that I'm doing at Cambridge at the moment, and a book that I'm currently writing for HarperCollins. And it was the subject of the Searching for My Slave Roots article, which went out on BBC Online, which kind of spawned all of this further. So a lot of the characters were already known about. Everyone knows William Ewart Gladstone, everyone knows John Gladstone. Loads of people, knew of, William Roscoe's abolitionist credentials and so on. There was less knowledge about the Sandbaches and the Tinnies, apart from specialist individuals. People like Lawrence knew about them because obviously he studied slavery in Liverpool, Ray Costello and a couple of others. But there wasn't a wide knowledge about them in the context of like the interrelationship. People, for instance, didn't know that Samuel Sandbach, Mayor of Liverpool in 1831, was also, his wife was the third cousin of Anne Mackenzie Robertson, who was the mother of Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, making them family members. Samuel Sandbach's wife's sister, Christian Robertson, was initially her first husband was James Watson, who was the Chamberlain to Lord Dundas, the Earl of Orkney. And I'm a direct descendant through slavery of Christian, which relates me to Gladstone. One of the things that I found really interesting when there was a debate here in Liverpool about whether or not Gladstone's name should continue to be used on the halls of residence, I was approached by someone here to step in on behalf of one of the students. There was a student here, Caleb Howie, who had written a piece about why it was important to take Gladstone's name off the halls of residence, and he'd been completely destroyed publicly on Twitter by a professor here of political science who argued that Gladstone was a great guy, that he was the best prime minister Britain's ever had, that he was an abolitionist, that students are, politically illiterate, that they had no clue what they were talking about. And, I'm thinking, don't professors have a duty of care to the students that they teach to not damage them publicly in that way? It was just absurd. But he asked me, could I give him some insight? And I'm like, well, Gladstone's in my family tree. So let me tell you what I know about William Ewart Gladstone. I know that he campaigned as an abolitionist for not only for the abolition of slavery, but the abolition of slavery with compensation, of which his father was the single largest recipient. And when his father died in 1851, him and his siblings inherited all of it. I also know, and you can check this in the Hansard, that when the apprenticeship system was coming to an end due to end in 1838, he went back to Parliament again after his father had already received over £100,000 for, compensation for the loss of his 3,500, 4,000 enslaved in Dalgarno in the Caribbean, the biggest payouts of anyone at that point. William Ewart Gladstone was arguing for the end of the apprenticeship system for his father to receive another £100,000. So, that's your William Ewart Gladstone, 4 times Prime Minister. I would argue that him being 4 times Prime Minister was a quid pro quo for the deal that he managed to strike through his father, for the benefit of all the West India planters, many of whom sat in Parliament. And there was a silver salver that was presented to John Gladstone for negotiating favourable terms by the West India Committee, for negotiating favourable terms for bringing about the emancipation of the slaves. So, William Ewart Gladstone was groomed by his father to stand as an abolitionist. His father couldn't do that because he had so many people enslaved, in order to ensure that the compensation should come to him. There was we did an event in Parliament last week it's to do with the bicentenary of the 1823 uprising in Demerara, the slave uprising, which is not until August, but there was Wilberforce had made a speech in 1823, asking for a large and liberal atonement for the enslaved, for the atrocity of slavery. That speech was echoed on the 15th of May by Buxton in the House. And some kind of way between Buxton's speech of 1823 and the Emancipation Act of 1833, John Gladstone and the West India Committee based here in Liverpool managed to sway that large and liberal tolerance away from the enslaved towards themselves. And many of the institutions that were founded subsequently, will have benefited in one way or another from the income that they received, because it said that people like merchants, West Indian merchants who were considered insolvent the day before, were not only liquid the day after, but were in positions to start giving out loans to other people because they had so much of this influx of wealth. It would be the equivalent of what we call today quantitative easing. When you're injecting liquidity into the economy to sort of, stave off an impending crisis, the crisis of, now there's no more free labour. We did the same thing with the banking crisis. I think this was the biggest, example of that until the bank bailouts that we did. So this gives a sort of an example of how these institutions, when you're considering a place like Liverpool, particularly Liverpool, and I'm not excluding other places, in the UK like Glasgow and Bristol, Lancaster, and others that were very instrumental and involved. But I'm saying when we consider a place like this, which was a beneficiary to such a huge extent, and you consider the institutions that exist here today that still continue to not only bear the names of these individuals, but continue to proliferate and enjoy the beneficial interest from those things, the decolonization process becomes imperative, because it's not just about saying that these guys did this and that was terrible. It's about reparative justice as well. And part of the reparative justice argument should include opening up opportunities for people like me. I couldn't get into a Russell Group university. I didn't have the requisite qualifications because of the legacy of slavery and colonialism, because of the residue of that within the social fabric of the society. That said, he's a black person, put him in the ghetto and don't let him in. Do you see what I mean? So me having the opportunity to unlock my potential was precluded from caring because of the legacies of slavery and colonialism. And that continues to this day.
Thank you, Malik. Do you feel that, literature has any part to play within this process of decolonization, as you called it? Your last book was a memoir, and it drew from your personal experiences. It was a tribute to Gil Scott Heron. And at one point, you mentioned that you were almost training to become a lawyer, and then you realized that, no, actually, I want to write poetry. So how important?
I dropped out of law school.
So how important was poetry for you and literature in general in this whole process and idea?
So the reason, I went to law school was because I wanted to sue the council for my time in care. So I spent 10 years in litigation against the council, and the lawyers were crap. They just weren't representing the interests of the clients. They were milking it. I saw law firms that started with this group litigation with 2 lawyers, and by the time we got 10 years in, they had 30, 40 lawyers in the firm. So a lot of these law firms actually built themselves on these cases of historical abuse that had happened in the care system. So there was a focus within the care system on the historical sexual abuse that had taken place in those institutions. And I had not suffered sexual abuse, but I'd suffered physical abuse. I'd been locked in solitary confinement. My introduction to care at the age of 9 was to be locked in a room 14 days and nights behind bars. I'd been taken away from my mum, thrown in a room and locked behind bars. No one would talk to me, no one explained anything. I was marched into a courtroom, heard the Latin words and logo parentis, and suddenly my mother had no rights over me, the state had the rights. So how did it come that someone was able to take away freedoms that I enjoy as a human being and take away the rights of my parents and vest them with the state? So I did a lecture at the Blue Coat recently. I was asked to look at the colonial legacies of the Blue Coat, which was founded by a slave trader and the church in 1797. And one of my slave owner ancestors, John Ernst Tinney, was the treasurer there until 1921. So when I started looking at this history, I started to realise that the civic legislation that was being passed by people like Samuel Sandbach when he was mayor of Liverpool, and the Liverpool Corporation, which was not the institution that we know today as Liverpool City Council, the Liverpool Corporation, anyone who knows the 70s will remember we used to call them the Corpy. It was always the Corpy, wasn't it? It was not like the council, We used to call it the Corby. So it was the Liverpool Corporation manager of the Corby. Yeah. So we say, if you had a corporation house, they say, oh, we live in the Corby house. You know, it's like, now it's a council house. But the corporation, the Liverpool Corporation, if you go back to Picton's memorials or any of these, you'll see that the corporation is always regarded as being something that was held by bondholders. So the bondholders own the corporation. So if they needed a dock for their ships, they built a dock. If they needed sanitation for their businesses, they built a road and they built drains and sanitation. They did the things, the civic works that they did because it benefited them, not because it was necessarily for the public good. So the bondholders, there was an act of Parliament that was being going through the House of Lords on corruption in civic office, and the Liverpool Corporation were told to oppose it because obviously they must have been corrupt, so they didn't want to be like held accountable for the corruption. And Samuel Sandbach stepped in when the bankers, Leyland and Bullens, who was slave-owning bank, they were the bankers to the corporation at the time, and they said, if you don't effectively oppose this anti-corruption bill going through Parliament, we're going to pull the plug on the corporation. And the bill went through the House of Lords and it got passed, and Leyland and Bullens bankrupt Liverpool Corporation by demanding the full debt. On the day it was about £11,500, it was like 18 or something like that. Samuel Sandbach then stepped in and drew a cheque for £11,500 on the bank that he was invested in at the time, which was Arthur Haywood and Sons, and bailed out Liverpool Corporation. So he single-handedly bailed out Liverpool Corporation. And then the following day, the account for Liverpool Corporation moved from the slave trading bank of Leyland and Bullens to the slave trading bank of Arthur Haywood and Sons. Samuel Sandbach was then involved in the formation, along with William Brown and others, of the Bank of Liverpool in 1831, which then acquired Arthur Haywood and Sons, and then the Liverpool Corporation account moved to Bank of Liverpool, who then acquired Martin's Bank and became Bank of Liverpool Martin's Bank Limited, then shortened to Martin's Bank. You'll see the Martin's Bank building next to the town hall, all from the proceeds of enslavement. That was acquired in 1969 by Barclays, and Liverpool City Council still back with Barclays to this day. So you can see how the people who were making the laws and the rules, the civic rules, and had control of the civic offices, their finances, the merit, and were also like John Gladstone MP sitting in Parliament and had their son as 4 times Prime Minister and so on, that they had the power to be able to make these kind of edicts. John Gladstone sent a bill to Parliament for the effective management of the poor in Liverpool. He also sent a bill to Parliament for the establishment of a House of Corrections in Kirkdale, and he wrote out all of the laws, what would be, the protocols that they should do in order to, manage this House of Corrections. So these guys are enacting the legislation that would allow people to be criminalised and then placed in the House of Corrections and then sentenced to do hard labour. In the colonies, where they were building the railways, these guys were invested in the railways. Philip Frederick Tinney paid for the survey for the line from Liverpool to Manchester for the establishment of the train line. George Stephenson of the Rocket was their engineer. And in the prospectus for the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, John Gladstone is the head guy. He's the head guy. Stephenson's his engineer. Okay? So then they go off and build the railways in these places, but they're setting up the kind of penal laws that would allow them to sentence people to hard labour, building railways that they own. They were creating, indentureships at the Blue Coat for training of clerks to serve the merchant houses. So you go and indenture yourself, a poor Liverpool lad, go and indenture yourself to the Blue Coat to get your education. You get your education in the Blue Coat. You then go and work at one of these merchant houses because they needed people, they needed scribes, they needed people who were literate who could do that. The majority of the population was illiterate. They needed people who were numerate who could manage this stuff. These guys would run multinational corporations by hand. They needed people who could write and people who were numerate, so they trained them. And they needed governesses for their children, so the women who went to the Blue Coat were all trained, in the classics, and they were all taught languages, and they were all treated, taught elocution and all this kind of stuff, and then they would go and become governesses for their children privately in their homes, indentured. So these people are creating, the same people who are creating the laws around enslavement, the same people who are creating the laws around apprenticeship, the same people creating the laws around indentureship, are the same people who are creating the penal codes, are the same people who are then sentencing people to hard labour in the colonies to build the railroads, are the same people who invested in the railroads, are the same people who then passed on houses that they owned to Liverpool Corporation. One of which was the one that I was locked up in at 9 years old, called the Liverpool Children's Admission Unit on Acrefield Road in Woolton, which was a gift from Henry Tate, the Tate and Lyle fame, to his daughter. The second one I was in, where I was also locked behind bars, was on Menlove Avenue, which was a former home of Gladstone. So these people are handing their properties over to the corporation that they bankrolled all these times ago, creating this legislation to take away the freedom of individuals to vest them with the state or with ownership of other people, and then passing down this property and then using that property to take away the rights of children like me under the Children's Act of 1969 and put the state in loco parentis and stick me in the slave trader Gladstone's house behind bars in 1975. So now, do you see what I'm talking about when I talk about the ontology of these networks, the prosopography that emerges from this? If I'd have been stuck within the historiography of, slavery, or if I'd have been stuck within the historiography relating to the Industrial Revolution or whatever, I wouldn't have seen any of this. I only see this because I look at these guys as a family. I'm not looking at any of those subjects as subjects. I'm interested in one family, the one that I come from. And if they're in the family, I want to see what they did. And the picture that emerges comes as a consequence of that. And that's why the research was considered seminal. And I was able to see things connections that other people didn't make. It was hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, that's the kind of genealogical work that you're doing is itself a kind of decolonizing practice, in a way, it sounds to me. But of course, your work has also gone beyond your research, because you're also an activist. You shape policy. You worked on breaking the barriers to academia for Black people. So how do you see your research informing your activism or your policy work?
Well, the people who helped me were activists, first and foremost. Gil Scott-Heron was, people know him as a poet, godfather of rap, whatever, but he was first and foremost an activist. He'd grown up in the Deep South. He'd grown up under Jim Crow. When Brown versus Board of Education, the law that was passed by the Supreme Court, which essentially desegregated the South, happened, he was one of the kids that was taken from the black areas and bussed into the white areas to go to those white schools, where the KKK were burning crosses on the lawns and the local police wouldn't protect black children going in there, and they had to bring in state troopers and little 11-year-old girls clutching their books trying to get into the school, and the KKK wanted to kill them. And, all that happened in the 1950s, and Gil was in school, and he went through that, and he grew up in Jackson, Tennessee. So he'd seen all that segregation and Jim Crow and, the residue of, the antebellum South, he'd seen all that, sharecroppers and the blues and all of the narratives that had emerged from that firsthand. So he understood the history of how we came to be in the situation that we were in, and that informed his activism. When he was a student at Lincoln University, the last poets were on the scene. The last poets emerged really at the end of the Civil Rights Movement. All the civil rights leaders had been killed. We'd had J. Edgar Hoover, COINTELPRO, Paul Robeson got his passport taken off him because he went to Russia and said, no, Russia never called me a nigger. And, he was classed as un-American, so there's this House Un-American Activities Commission that was going on. It was like a witch hunt. Kit had been told, she'd gone to the White House and made, Lady Buck Johnson cry when she talked about, how black people were being slaughtered in the Vietnam War, and her husband was just sending black people to be slaughtered, and she cried. So she totally destroyed Eartha Kitt's career. Eartha Kitt didn't get a movie for like 30 years because, you know, she went to the White House and had the audacity to upset the president's wife, you know what I mean? These kind of things were happening. And a lot of black people, you know, Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Malcolm had been assassinated, Black Panthers had been imprisoned, a lot of them had gone into exile. People turned to the artists. So the Black Arts Movement emerged, you know, which had like Amiri Baraka at the head of it. And Amiri Baraka was kind of, you know, promoting what was happening with the East Wind Associates, the Harlem Writers Workshop. You know, previously it had, in the 1920s, you'd had the Harlem Renaissance, post-slavery. Black people weren't allowed to read and write. And then suddenly you've got this, you know, this upsurge of black creatives, you know, people like Langston Hughes and, you know, Gene Toomer and others had emerged during that period. And, you know, there'd been this whole movement to try and get black people to have a creative voice, but also to become literate. So, you know, that promotion of that, if you like, had a resurgence in the at the end of the civil rights movement, and, you know, the whole Black and Proud thing, you know, started an encouragement towards black people wanting to get more educated, and that was all driven not by changes in the law, not by, you know, the curriculum. It was all being driven by activism. It was all being driven from the streets. So the consequence of that, which led to the formation of the Black Arts Movement, led to things like the Last Poets. And the Last Poets were touring the college circuit when Gil Scott-Heron was at Lincoln. And he picked up on, you know, the Last Poets' work, and then went on and built The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And, you know, and then, you know, the foundations of what we today call rap and hip-hop all sorts of emerged from that. So it was a kind of a cultural arm, if you like, to what in Canada, when I went to Canada, I did some tours in Canada, they call them artivists. You know, it's an activist who uses their art form as a means of activism, as a platform to be able to communicate thoughts and ideas that will trigger people not just to be entertained, but to think. And if you think from the period of enslavement, you know, today, you know, black people have always been encouraged to sing and dance. But when given the opportunities to be able to participate in so many other stratas of society. So these guys thought, if they were all going to let us do is sing and dance, we'll sing and dance, but with a political message. And the politics was then woven in, sometimes in a very, you know, sort of subversive, but kind of under the table kind of way, where it was kind of coded into the narratives of the songs, or even in the expression forms of the dance and the theatrics. But as time went on, it became far more. By the 60s, it was just explicit. You know, niggers are scared of revolution. That was the Last Poets. You know, when the revolution comes, Gil Scott-Heron, the revolution will not be televised. So these things became far more overt, far more explicit, far more direct and in your face, and that was very threatening to white society. So there was a kind of a pushback from that and a kind of pendulum swing again. But what had happened was you got like a whole another generation of people who had become literate and who had become active, not because of anything that they were getting through the normal kind of linear channels that you were referring to before, Sreya, but because of activism that was happening on the side that was being driven primarily through a cultural lens.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I am going to now invite questions from the audience. And Anna Laura has very kindly agreed to handing around the mic. So if you do have a question, just raise your hand and please try to keep it succinct so that more people have the opportunity to ask Malik questions or engage with him. So whenever you're ready, if you have a question, please just raise your hand.
I wondered if you could remember the feeling of, or that first moment of seeing Cambridge, of the 24-hour libraries, of the astounding kind of wealth of educational facilities in the city, and the encounter with people who had been through really, really privileged kind of backgrounds in education. Do you remember the kind of what that felt like to encounter And what are your thoughts on how do you make something positive of that in terms of educational ideas?
So the first time I actually went to Cambridge was in 2011. It was when Gilles Cohen had passed away. We'd just been on tour doing his final tour in 2010, and he passed away in I think the May of 2011. And his publisher and his record label came to me and said to me, "Look, Gil told us a bit about your story. Would you be willing to tell your story? Because all the press are asking us for narrative, and we don't know what to say, But we think if we don't give them something, they'll make something up. So, would you be willing to tell your story?" And I had never ever spoken to the press in all the 20 odd years I've been working with Gil. But I thought, in this sense, I wouldn't want him to be remembered. He'd just come out of prison, he'd had some problems with drugs. I didn't want him to be remembered in that way. So I wanted people to understand what he'd done for me. So I took the opportunity to speak to Simon Hasselstone at The Guardian, and he said, "I want 400 words." So I started talking, and as you can probably imagine, they ended up publishing it over 4 pages in The Guardian, so it was called Searching for My Slave Roots. And as a consequence of that, the Islamic Society, the Black Student Society, and the Faculty of English invited me to go to Cambridge to speak and to do a recital, a poetry recital and a performance. So I took Gil's drummer with me, and we got a percussionist and a bass player, and we went and we did a poetry recital at Cambridge with the band. And when I'm there, obviously, it's the Faculty of English. I've got all these professors asking me about poetry, and I'm thinking, I don't even have a GCSE in English, and I don't even know grammar. I still to this day don't know what an adverb is. Do you know what I mean? I really don't. I don't know grammar. And these poetry professors are asking me all this stuff about poetry, and I'm explaining what I know, but I don't, and they're trying to translate it into their speak. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, why in the hell are you guys asking me? You should know. And then I thought to myself, well, if they don't know what I know, then why couldn't I be here? Like, it just sort of, there was just a little thing, and it was just a passing thing that just came in my head and left, and I never gave it enough thought until in 2017 when I was invited to go back and present some of my findings around my slavery ancestry. And again, I'm back in the room now, but this is the Faculty of Latin American Studies, and I've got all these anthropologists and people, people who, written loads of books and papers on all this sort of, Latin American stuff and slavery, whatever. And again, I presented my findings, and none of them had ever heard anything about it, so it was all new to them. So I think at that point I realised that, look, these people are no, and it demystified it for me. There was like, there's this thing, you put these things on, you put people on pedestals, and you think they're there, and I'm like here, and I can never traverse that. This place is not for me. And that's part of the reason why we need to do decolonization, because, as a black person growing up in Liverpool, no university was for me. Do you know what I mean? Not even Hope. No disrespect to Hope. It was just like,
I want to find Hope.
One university at the time, but I'm saying I couldn't even get into a college. I remember going to my one college and trying to sign up to do A-levels, and there was 3 of us went, me and my 2 mates, and they both got accepted and I got rejected. So, because I just didn't have the requisite stuff to get in. So that's why, I think it's important for us to, if we get opportunities to be able to demonstrate our capacity, our capabilities, our worth, that we use that in whatever place we go to change that place. So 2 weeks ago, I was awarded the Vice Chancellor's Award for Global Impact, and the Vice Chancellor at Cambridge, Andy Freeling, who's the interim Vice Chancellor, if you Google him, he came in at the back of the slavery inquiry, which had been brought about by Professor Troop, who was considered to be a war lefty from Canada, and Canada was like a factor, because he's Canadian, he's probably a war lefty. Go figure. And he launched the slavery inquiry into Cambridge's historical links to enslavement. And this new guy comes in, and the first thing he does is he puts this article on the front page of like the Daily Mail. New Chancellor of Cambridge doesn't know what decolonization means or how we should do it. He's going to roll back everything that the woke lefty did, the previous thing. And this is the guy that's given me the award for global impact, but he doesn't know that the global impact that I've been doing has all been around reparations, decolonization, and widening participation, while Cambridge is busy narrowing participation, trying to roll back any notion of decolonization, because this guy doesn't know what it is or why we should do it. So he stands up and he gives me the award and, shakes my hand and all that, and then I give my acceptance speech. So I'm standing here talking about where my global social impact has come from, the decolonization work that I'm doing. He's sitting there cringing. He should have seen how quickly he got out the room. But that is a way of being able to get in them institutions. I was able to demonstrate to him that, the work I'm doing now, we've got a bill in Parliament at the moment. It's had its first reading in the House of Lords called the Widening Access and Participation Bill. And if it gets through, it will amend the Higher Education Research Act to make it more equitable for people of colour to be able to get kind of positive action provisions that are needed in order to be able to access higher education. Because the existing legislation is so unclear in the distinction between positive action and positive discrimination that a lot of institutions are now saying, oh, we can't do that because it's discriminatory against white people. So they won't ring-fence funds for black academics. So the positive action provisions that were in the Racial Relations Amendment Act of 2000 and the Race Equalities Act of 2010 are now being used counter, to their initial intention, which was to redress these historical injustices. They're now being used as a safe harbour for racists to not do it because it's seen as being discriminatory against white people. But when we brought a barrister in and some parliamentarians, and we had a round table on the legislative framework that creates these barriers, we asked for a clear distinction between positive action and positive discrimination. Positive action is lawful, positive discrimination is unlawful. And the barrister had to go to about 5 different statutes to be able to construe the distinction. So imagine someone sitting writing a funding bid in a university on an academic department, wants to ring-fence some funding for black academics, sends it off to legal. Legal takes an advice from a barrister. They then take a secondary advice from an external barrister. All of that advice is privileged, so no one can see it. Yeah? And then they come back and say, oh, maybe because they've used this word, that could be seen as being discriminatory. So therefore, boom, this is positive discrimination. You can't do it. It's unlawful. University goes, thank you very much. Yeah, we can't do it. It's unlawful. Boom, no positive action. So what we want to do is clarify the law both on the statutory level and also on the policy level. So there's a clear distinction that if you follow this pathway to positive action, you can ring-fence your funds for black academics, and it's perfectly lawful to do so. But that may involve either a change in the statutory guidance or a change in the law. And hopefully our bill will initiate a process by which we can do that. We're also working with Fiona Beveridge and the Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Bristol on producing a policy brief which regards all the HEIs across the country to make recommendations for the Office for Students, recommendations for the HEIs, and recommendations for funders on what they can do to lift the barriers to black academia. And that's work that I've been doing simultaneously whilst I've been doing my PhD. This is what we call a black tax. A white person coming in would just get their funding and get to do their PhD. I'm having to change the laws and do all this kind of stuff just while I'm going along and still do my PhD,
I don't know how you're doing that. It's amazing. Yes, there's a question there and then.
Hi, I'm a foster carer for Liverpool City Council. Tips.
I never got involved with foster care. I never had the benefits of being fostered. So it wasn't something that it wasn't an option that was presented to me. So I never went through that aspect of the system. I often think if I had been fostered, well, I had a different experience. I know people who did go through the foster system and had a really good experience. I know people who went through that system and had a really bad experience. And I know people who've had experiences kind of in between. Because they enjoyed being fostered for a time, right up until the foster parent decided they didn't want them anymore, and then they kind of passed them back again. So, but again, I know people who were fostered and they put them kids through private schools and they still call them mum to this day, do you know what I mean? So it's a track within the kind of looked after children pathways that I never experienced or got to experience, so I couldn't really speak with any authority on it. Or really give any advice on it, I'm afraid. I'd like to think that I could, but I honestly can't.
I'd love to have fostered you. I'm really sorry for your experience because it's rubbish. And, I'm not old enough to have fostered you, but I hope you do a better job now than the one that you experienced.
Well, maybe they need people like you in the system more, so hopefully you can take your example and use it as an example of good practice for others, I was invited this year to the Care Commissioners Conference in Derbyshire to deliver their keynote in the wake of the review of the care review, the child social care review, some of which I was critical of, to be honest with you, but also I know that the intention behind it was good. And what I wanted to do was use my book there, I said to girls, like a kind of a test case of what not to do with a child, and I tried to demonstrate through my own experiences that absolutely every aspect of the system, from the moment I went in through the Children's Act of 1969, right the way through to the point which I was deposited in a homeless hostel at 18 with £100 from social services and abandoned, that they did every possible point at which they could have intervened positively, they did something detrimental and damaging. And really what I wanted when they did the review of child social care was for them to learn from the lessons of the past. So I said, take this book as a kind of an example, if you like, a case study of what not to do with a child. What I think also what it demonstrated was that when you get someone like Gil Scott-Heron come along, he was not in loco parentis, he had no duty of care to me, he was not, connected, he wasn't even a citizen of this country, he didn't have no responsibility for me whatsoever. But as one caring adult in my life, he was able to mentor me in such a way as to be the difference between complete failure and complete success. Whereas the state who were in loco parentis, who did have a duty of care, they failed in all of that. Do you know what I mean? It was systemic failure. Yeah, it was systemic failure all the way through. So I try to use that as an example of what not to do.
We've got one question here and then two there.
You described as a roadblocks getting through the education system.
I don't think your mic's on. There's a switch you can switch on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You described those as roadblocks getting through the education system. The average person would give up. What's given you that resilience and like to push through and get to where you are now?
I wouldn't necessarily call it resilience. It was just an absolute, obsessive desire to have justice. When you've been the victim of injustice and you know it's injustice and you're being conditioned to believe that it's you. We were told as kids you're maladjusted. You're a product of your environment. Society's being protected from you. I'm like 9 years old. Like, what am I going to do to society? But I'm being conditioned to believe this stuff, and I'm being socialized to think of myself as this, this menace to society. So many of the people who went through that system grew up and became that. One of the kids who was actually in the room next to me in the dormitories in one of the homes was the guy who was on the roof in the Strange Ways prison riot with a balaclava leading the riot. I'm saying, like, they were conditioning us for that. There was some research done by a woman called Professor Debbie Watson at the Bristol Institute at the University of Bristol, and she was doing research on women in prisons. And as part of the research, she's just going into the prisons and doing these questionnaires, like sort of semi-structured questionnaires. It's an ethnographic study, trying to get some qualitative data on, what brings women to the prisons. And a lot of these women made disclosures to her which were not part of the survey. It turns out that something like 68% of the female prison population were formerly in the care system. And the disclosures that were being made to her was that a substantial proportion of them were sexually abused and exploited whilst they were in the care system, which then led them on to become in the prison system. And the majority of them that went into the care system went in as babies or young children, as because they were familial breakdown. They were not in there because they committed crimes, but they were criminalised through the process because of what they were subjected to in the system. So society is effectively creating the people that it's afraid of and then creating institutions to manage them and contain them. Do you know what I mean? It's counterproductive. Whereas if positive interventions had been made in those children's lives at the early stages, perhaps positive fostering, adoption, whatever, then the life track of those girls could have been substantially different. Do you know what I mean? But this is the failings of the state. But then who are the state? The state is your John Gladstone slave traders, your Samuel Sandbaches, your Philip Frederick Tinneys, your John Ernst Tinneys, do you know what I mean? These are the state. Today you would be your Rees Moggs and those kind of characters. These are the people who are sitting there making the legislation, which is filtering down to the civic levels, which is then being enacted in these legislations and being, imposed upon people in society. And they couldn't do it if we didn't give them the permission to do so. We permit them to do that. They only control society because we, as a society, allow them to do so. The power is actually with us, but we don't mobilize in a way as to exercise that power. Generally, when we do, you see what happens, like Black Lives Matter, like the Civil Rights Movement, and these are the periods where there's change, but it's never change because it's the right thing to do. It's change because they're forced to do it.
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, but there will be time even after this outside to continue the conversation. So, go ahead.
My questions are related to what you were just talking about. My burning desire is knowing how to address the inequalities in our education system for our children, particularly in LA where I live. We've got amazing schools on our doorstep, but the majority of our children, if you're from a minority group or Muslim, they're very hard to get into. And some of that's because they're faith schools, so they only allow maybe 5 or 7 kids to get in. But what it means is our kids get sent to the 6 schools right across the city. And it's a massive problem, and it's been going on for generations. And my question to you is, how can we decolonize the admissions process, which to me, I just think it's criminal, that if you live in LA and you apply for one of 5 choices, apparently it's the norm to not get one of 5. And last year there was nearly 600 kids in our area who didn't get one of 5, and children from outside the area are coming in and they're taking up space in our area, the best schools, but we can't get into them. And this has long-lasting impact. It's intergenerational, so we've got to break it. And I'm interested to know how we could improve the situation.
Yeah, so this is a kind of academic apartheid that's been established. So they have obviously the faith schools, so you've got the Catholic schools, the Protestant schools, the Jewish schools. There's no Muslim schools, you're not allowed to have a Muslim school. You can have any faith apart from a Muslim school. I don't think there's a Hindu school either, but generally there's been lots of things for a Muslim school, you can't have one. So for the Muslim population, which the substantial proportion of the black community is within the Muslim population, they want to get into a good school. The majority of the good schools are faith schools. So the faith schools then have the ability to be able to positively, it is a kind of discrimination in a sense. They'll say that you have to be from our faith. So for instance, if you want to get into Belrive, you've got to be Catholic. So Belrive has buses that go all over the city and bring Catholics from all over the city. So I live around the corner from Belrive, but I can get my daughter in Belrive. But people from Huyton and, Skelmersdale, because they're Catholic, can get in Belrive. And then if they have any places left over, then it'll be other Christian denominations. And the only ones who can get in who are non-Christians would be through appeal. And the appeals would generally go through the panels, and the panels would then say, the local authority will fund you to create extra places, and then someone from a different faith would then get in on the basis of that. Archbishop Blanche is the same. It's one of the best performing schools in the city. When you want to get into Archbishop Blanche, you've got to be Christian. If you're not Christian, then it's different. They've got an allocation of about, I think it's 5% or something. For other faiths, and other faiths is every other faith. So whether I don't think you do no faith, but it's like every other faith. So it's, your chances of getting in are limited. Liverpool College had the same thing. It was private before. It's now an academy. You get a situation where you want to get into Liverpool College, which up until the point it became an academy actually had the Gladstone Scholarship. So I never managed to get to do the thing with Liverpool College. I don't know if Lawrence, did you ever get down with the Liverpool College thing? But the Gladstone Scholarship, it's been going on for God knows how long at Liverpool College, so Gladstone was involved there some kind of way. But again, with that, they've got this sibling thing, that if you've got a sibling in there, that you can get in, and then if you haven't got a sibling, you can't get in. So they're creating all this exclusive criteria, which basically keep them out. And then they'll have the schools, like we used to have Paddy Conk, and Shawfields, and they would always direct all the black kids to Paddycombe or Shawfields. And I'm not saying that people who went to those schools, that there wasn't some people who did okay. There was some people who did okay, but generally, when you were put in one of those schools, you were almost like written off. And you were forced into them if you were not of those faiths, or if you were from the black community within those faiths, you were then directed to one of those schools. I was only able to subvert that with my children by putting all my children in private schools. I paid to put my children in Merchant Taylors and Belvedere when it was the thing, and the Girls' Day School Trust in Birkenhead, and also the Auckland College. So I've literally paid for all my children to go to private education because I had the worst possible education that a human being could have in this country. I paid for my children to have the best education, not because I support private schools or I think it's a wonderful thing to go into these places. They're all bad actors as far as I'm concerned. But it's because I knew as a black person and also as a Muslim, I had to subvert that process. And the only way for me to subvert that process was to pay. And most people can't do that. I was fortunate that I could, so I did, for those very reasons that you're saying. And again, it's the civic authorities that are making these decisions. And the civic authorities, through delegated legislation, are, literally making the determination as to why you can't have a Muslim school, for instance, and why, the black people should be put in these schools and those schools, and why there's such a low attainment level in each of those schools. So when you get to 16 and you then want to get into a college, you're more likely to go into City College than you are to go into sixth form. And then if you're coming out of City College rather than sixth form, you're less likely to get into Russell Group University. And then if you're not in Russell Group University, you're less likely to get funded for a master's. And if you don't get a first class, honours degree and a master's with distinction, you're less likely to progress to a PhD, which is why there's so few black professors in the country. And when you look at the higher education mix, the funding mix, UKRI, it's public money, but there's only 0.4% of UKRI's money was distributed to UKRI's money was distributed, only 0.4% of it went to Black British and Black Caribbean. We don't pay 0.4% of the taxes, and that's taxpayers' money. That's 15% of the entire higher education funding mix. So then there's virtually no black professors, then you've got no books being written that end up on the curriculum, peer-reviewed documents that would end up being studied at university. So this whole process of decolonising the curriculum becomes impossible because you're only getting the people who can get to the best schools, who can then go to the best colleges, who can then go to sixth forms, go to the best universities, who can then don't have the intersectional disadvantages, can get the highest results, who would then get the funding to go on and be to the professoriate, who would then be able to write the peer-reviewed documents that get studied on the curriculum. Do you see what I mean? And it's that cycle. So it starts right at the beginning of the school, and that discrimination runs right the way through from the bottom to the top. And each element of it feeds into the next element of it. And to understand it, you've got to traverse every single one of those elements. And having done that myself, I'm now in a position where I'm trying to change it at a statutory level, I'm trying to change it at a policy level, and I'm trying to provide guidance for universities and HEIs to be able to say, within the context of the existing framework, this is what you can do by way of good practice and best practice, and you will be in a position where you're unlocking the potential of people like me, and we're bringing something to the table, we're adding value here, we're not sitting there like destroying the system and bringing it down, we're adding value, and there's many more people who could do that. I always wonder what someone like Curtis Warren would have done if he'd got an education. Do you know what I mean? He went on to become like one of the biggest gangsters on planet Earth. Do you know what I mean? Running the biggest drugs empire that you can possibly imagine. Curtis Warren was in the same institution with me in 1975. He was like two years older than me. And we were stuck in the same institution together. He went through that system and then went on to become like the biggest kingpin, drug lord, whatever. But imagine, the guy could have been running a Fortune 500 company if he'd been given the actual proper guidance. And, and there's many people like that. So the track that you put us on is don't be surprised when we arrive at that destination.
Okay, we've got time for one more question for this session. Yes.
I'm obviously not from Nigeria. I came to Liverpool, I'll say by chance. I came on shore. I came to a short course.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I've got the mic close to your mouth.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, as I'm an overseas nurse from Nigeria, I came to Liverpool to study a short course on tropical diseases, and that's how I stumbled on the word decolonization of healthcare, and had a lot of things about global south, global north, and this has opened a lot of thinking in me. So my question is not even a question, I'll just ask him what advice you have for me going into this.
So I've been doing some work. Are you after the school chocolate medicine?
Yeah.
So I've been doing some work with the school chocolate medicine. I delivered a workshop for the senior leadership team with the directors a couple of months ago around decolonizing their archives, because they're 125 years this year, and they have their archives from when they were founded in 1897. And then I did a workshop with the senior staff as well on the idea of digitising their archives, making it available for research and decolonization. And Professor Jason Arday has just completed the School of Tropical Medicine's race equity plan. And whilst that was being conducted, I presented to them on barriers to black academia and the historic racism that occurs within the academy, and the disparities between the way in the School of Tropical Medicine, for instance, the African scholars are being paid on a different tier than the European scholars, and how they needed to do something to address that fundamental inequity, and how they also needed to think about positive action provisions to address historic injustices and the fact that they actually proliferated from the development of scientific research within Africa, some of which was really nefarious in terms of what they did, particularly in the Congo. They then responded by creating 2 Black British PhD studentships, fully funded, as part of the race equity commitment, and that's written into their race equity plan, which was a direct consequence of our work with them. They added that to what Jason Arday had also recommended. But these organisations are moving slowly, and they're moving cautiously, because they're considering reputational damage, they're considering their brand. There was a lot of articles about the London School of Tropical Medicine, and the sort of links to colonial experiments and sort of nefarious things that they were doing in Africa, and that sort of filtered through everything as well. So the School of Tropical Medicine are also very aware of that, and they want to tread cautiously. And what I'm trying to say to them is, like, you can't continue to tiptoe around your history. You can't unlive the history. It happened. What you can do is you can be on the right side of it or the wrong side of it. If you're going to be on the right side of it, then digitise your archives, lay them bare. 75% of their archives sit here in the Sidney Jones Library. Okay? So I'm working with the School of Tropical Medicine to try and get them now to make their archives available, because a lot of the pseudoscience that sort of predominated through the colonial period, from when they were founded in 1898 right the way through, the whole kind of eugenics movement, was predicated upon stuff that they did. And I said to them, as an academic institution, you award PhDs to people now. You demand academic excellence from the students that you bring in. You demand peer review. You demand, that the data is validated and that sources are referenced, and but you won't go back to your own stuff because of the amount of pseudoscience that is inherent within it, and allow it to go through the kind of same rigorous academic, quality control that you demand of your own students. And much of the racism that exists in society today is derived from that pseudoscience which was developed in that very institution along with others. And the fear of what reputational damage would be done to the institution by laying that bare is stopping them from having that conversation. So when people like you come in from Africa and you go to the School of Tropical Medicine and you do your, MTrop Med or your PhDs or whatever, and you get that accreditation and you leave, that conversation may not be had through the whole entire period. That conversation should have been had before you arrived. That conversation should be ongoing whilst you're there. They should be involved in that conversation. And as an institution, they should be leading on that. It's one thing to publish a race equity plan and ring-fence a couple of scholarships. It's another thing to do something, far more practical in terms of decolonization. And there has to be a commitment for that at all levels. You can bring someone like me and I can talk about these things endlessly. I did one with Kellogg's, with the president of Kellogg's. In a conversation like this, I had 200 executives from Kellogg's across Europe. And the first thing I said to him is, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a tick box exercise to say, we've made a statement for Black Lives Matter and now we're going to, sort of talk about equality, diversity and inclusion? Or do you want to do some written branch reform in your institution across Europe? And he was shocked. But when we got into the conversation, he actually opened with that. And then they brought in ED&I consultants and they're working with them. And you think, Kellogg's, why Kellogg's? Because he was asked to make a statement on Black Lives Matter. And he's looking at people, all across the world protesting. And he's saying, how many of them are Kellogg's cornflakes this morning? How many are Cocoa Pops? How many are Rice Krispies? These are our clients and this is what they care about. We need to be in this conversation. So the opportunity exists for these organizations to have these difficult conversations, but they have to put aside their fragility. They have to put aside their own sort of guilt, that idea of recoil. Oh my God, I'm white, I've had privilege. Oh my God, what will they do? Will there be revenge? Will they come for reparations? Is it going to cost us this? What reputational damage is it going to do? What's it going to do to the Barclays share price? All these kind of things, these conversations have to be put to one side, and we need to have an honest and open debate about all of these issues. And these institutions in all of these different places need to literally just come clean and go, these are our records, let's open the books and let's apply the same stringent academic rigour that we demand of our students today to our own institutions.
Thank you so much. That's a fitting note to end this part of the conversation. Thank you so much, Malik.
I have copies of my book and my CD, shameless plug. If anyone's interested, there's a QR code that you can scan for the book or the CD and pay with PayPal, or if anyone's got cash, I'll take cash as well. But there's a limited number of them, so I'm happy to sign them if anyone wants one as well. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you.
Thank you. And do help yourself to the refreshments outside as well.